During World War II, when people think about intelligence gathering, they often picture sealed interrogation rooms where fear and violence are used to break an enemy's will. But the United States chose a very different path. Instead of whips and torture, they placed a hot meal on the table, offered a cigarette, and treated defeated enemies with respect. This was not weakness or moral improvisation, it was a calculated intelligence strategy. By treating German and Italian prisoners humanely, the Americans led their enemies to speak voluntarily. And from those seemingly harmless dining tables, the Allies obtained strategically valuable secrets that no amount of torture could ever guarantee. In a war for survival, the way a nation treats prisoners of war is often the clearest mirror of its true character. For the U.S. military, this principle rested on a very specific foundation: strict adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention on prisoners of war. This was not only an expression of a humanitarian tradition, but also a disciplined, system-wide choice. When Axis prisoners fell into American hands, their lives were safeguarded. They were properly fed, received standard medical treatment, and most importantly, were treated as human beings rather than as trophies of victory. On American soil, more than 400,000 German, Italian, and Japanese soldiers were held during the war. And the paradox was that many of them later admitted they had never lived under such comfortable conditions during their years as ordinary enlisted men. This reality provoked considerable resentment among segments of the American public at the time, especially when newspapers reported scenes of German prisoners being served meals by white-clad attendants on trains, or Italian soldiers being escorted to opera performances in San Francisco. In a society sending its sons to the front while enduring rationing at home, such images were easily seen as excessive leniency. Yet, the U.S. government's position was unequivocal. Obeying international law and treating enemy prisoners humanely was not merely a moral obligation, but a practical means of protecting American soldiers should they fall into enemy hands. In other words, the United States played by the rules, not out of naivety, but because it looked beyond immediate emotions and understood the long-term value of maintaining standards even in war. In stark contrast stood the worldview of Nazi Germany and militarist Japan. Within their ideological frameworks, prisoners were not regarded as equals, but as contemptible losers. The use of violence to extract information was not only permitted, but considered a legitimate tool. The Gestapo, the infamous secret police of Nazi Germany, became the embodiment of this mindset. In interrogations, torture and brutality were the default methods. Beatings with batons, electric shocks, fingernail extraction, and prolonged abuse until the body itself was broken. The outcome was often predictable. Human beings were left shattered both physically and psychologically, while the information extracted was fragmented, unreliable, and at times entirely false. Many chose to endure in silence rather than betray their cause. The Austrian resistance network, led by Heinrich Meyer, stands as a telling example. Despite being brutally tortured, its members never revealed that they had secretly passed to the Allies the design schematics of the V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 rocket, and the Tiger tank intelligence of critical strategic value. Gestapo brutality, instead of breaking resistance, frequently achieved the opposite. It deepened resentment and hardened the resolve to remain silent. In the Pacific theater, the Japanese military earned a reputation for equal severity. Many Allied prisoners were starved, forced into exhausting labor, or summarily executed if they attempted to escape. The contrast could not have been clearer. One side treated humanitarian principles as standards to be upheld, while the other relied on fear as a tool of control. It was precisely within this stark contrast that the American strategy of intelligence, gathering through humane treatment, emerged as an unconventional yet carefully calculated choice, not because the United States was soft or ignorant of war's brutality. On the contrary, American intelligence leaders understood a simple truth. A mind free from immediate threat and a body that has been fed are far more likely to open up than one broken by pain. Instead of electric shocks and shouted threats, they offered a cigarette and a cup of hot coffee. Instead of damp, isolating cells, they created prison camps with warm blankets, proper beds, sports fields, and friendly soccer matches. This was not unconditional leniency, but a deliberate psychological approach aimed at weakening a prisoner's final line of defense, not through fear, but through the unexpected experience of being treated with respect, something many of them had never truly known even while serving in their own armies. Imagine a German POW camp on American soil in 1944. Not as wartime propaganda portrayed it, but as an entirely different world. The morning begins with the familiar sound of a bell, as hundreds of German soldiers who once fought in North Africa or on the European front quietly line up and walk into the mess hall. In front of them is not thin gruel meant merely to keep them alive, but hot trays filled with eggs, sausages, white bread, and steaming coffee. They eat in silence beneath the American flag hanging overhead, yet no one shouts at them, no one forces them to stand up or salute, and no one stages displays of power. Everything unfolds calmly, almost tediously, and it is precisely that calm which unsettles many of them the most. In the afternoon, after hours of labor in the fields or in repair workshops, the prisoners return to camp to play soccer on dirt fields, read books in the camp library, watch films in theaters, seating hundreds, or attend foreign language classes organized either by themselves or by Americans. Paper, pens, and paints are distributed for drawing and handicrafts, and musical instruments appear in the camp, enough to form small bands that play for their fellow prisoners. Camp Concordia in Kansas stands as a representative example. Built in just 3 months, it contained hundreds of barracks, a gymnasium, a library, and a theater with a seating capacity of 350, enough to accommodate thousands of prisoners without overcrowding. In many other camps, prisoners staged theatrical plays and cultural performances in German and Italian, recreating a cultural life that even during their years of military service, they had rarely been allowed to experience. Under U.S. government regulations, prisoner rations ranged from 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day, depending on labor demands, accompanied by full personal supplies from towels and toothbrushes to razors, no different from the standards provided to American soldiers. They could even purchase light beer and low-alcohol wine, consumed within permitted limits, as grown adults rather than humiliated captives. Medical services in the camps were strictly maintained. Prisoners received regular health checkups, vaccinations, dental care, and surgery when necessary, to standards comparable to those applied to U.S. military personnel. All of this created an almost unbelievable reality. The Americans deliberately sought to turn their prison camps into spaces as bearable as possible, within the constraints of war. That generosity was not merely a display of moral virtue or an exercise in image polishing. Behind it lay a highly practical calculation. As the American economy faced severe labor shortages with millions of young men sent to the front, the government made use of roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners as a supplementary workforce. They were sent to harvest grapes, pick cotton, process canned foods, cut timber, and repair railway lines, demanding yet essential jobs, and were paid about 80 cents per day. Not a few American farmers later admitted that they felt a sense of loss when German prisoners were repatriated, because many of these men had become diligent, disciplined workers and, in some cases, were treated almost like members of the family. Friendships formed around dinner tables and in the fields, crossing the line between victor and vanquished. Within this arrangement, both sides benefited. The American wartime economy was sustained, while the prisoners were able to momentarily set aside their defeated status within a relatively stable way of life. More importantly than anything else, this humane and respectful living environment gradually melted the psychological armor of even the most hardened prisoners. They no longer lived in constant fear of beatings or humiliation, but began to view their American guards through a different lens. Many quietly admitted to themselves that the enemy standing before them did not resemble the demonic image planted in their minds by Goebbels' propaganda. That shift in perception had a direct impact on their willingness to resist during interrogation. For a German officer, trained to believe that silence was the supreme duty, that death was preferable to disclosure, the situation was deeply disorienting. Now he was not tortured, not humiliated. What awaited him instead was a polite smile, a hot meal, and a cigarette offered at precisely the right moment. Brick by brick, the invisible wall of hostility began to crack. Not because of fear, but because of confusion and inner hesitation. And it was in that moment, as vigilance slowly loosened, that the Americans began to obtain what they were truly seeking: information. It was no coincidence that the U.S. military intelligence apparatus went far beyond ordinary prison camps to construct professional, highly secret strategic interrogation centers, specifically designed to exploit the psychological advantage created by humane treatment. P. Box 1142. A name that sounded like nothing more than an anonymous postal address, was in fact the code name for Fort Hunt. Quietly situated along the banks of the Potomac River, only a short drive from Washington, D.C. With no signage and no conspicuous military presence, the site existed almost invisibly on public maps. Beginning in 1942, German and Italian prisoners deemed high value were secretly transferred there before being assigned to standard POW camps. These were not anonymous enlisted men, but senior officers, scientists, military engineers, experienced pilots, and U-boat commanders who had once roamed the Atlantic, men who carried in their minds not only tactical information, but an understanding of how the Nazi war machine actually functioned. Fort Hunt's objective was stark and unsentimental: to extract every ounce of intelligence value before those minds could close themselves off. In sharp contrast to the familiar image of harsh interrogation rooms, the personnel assigned to P.O. Box 1142 were carefully selected and trained as an elite force. They were not brute jailers, but intelligence officers fluent in German, deeply familiar with German culture, psychology, and even national pride. Many were German Jewish émigrés who had fled Europe carrying bitter memories of the Nazi regime. Yet once inside the interrogation room, they were required to set aside personal grievances in service of a single objective: information gathering. Most had been trained at Camp Ritchie, the U.S. Army's intelligence forge, where they learned not only language skills, but how to read gestures, analyze reactions, exploit psychological vulnerabilities, and use silence itself as a weapon. At Fort Hunt, each prisoner was approached with a tailored script, carefully custom-fitted to personality and circumstance. Some were treated like guests, engaged in conversations about family, music, and life before the war. Others were subtly guided through internal contradictions, half-true and half-false information designed to make them recalibrate their own statements. Yet one rule was never broken: no torture, no violence, no physical threats of any kind. A former interrogation officer later recalled that this non-violent, individually adaptive approach became the foundation of modern interrogation standards, precisely because it produced intelligence that was deep, accurate, and verifiable, something brute force rarely delivered. The effectiveness of Fort Hunt was measured not in rumor, but in numbers and results. Between 1,942 and 1,945, 3,451 prisoners were interrogated there, with more than 5,000 formal interviews conducted and mountains of intelligence reports produced. But what happened inside the interrogation rooms was only half the story. The other half unfolded in moments that seemed harmless: shared meals, rest periods, casual conversations in the yard. Fort Hunt was fitted with microphones and hidden listening devices everywhere, from dormitories and hallways to places no one would suspect. giving rise to an internal saying among intelligence officers. Here. End quote. Tucson. Tucson. End quote. Tucson. Tucson. Even the trees can listen. In addition, the system made use of plants. Prisoners who appeared to share the same background and emotional state, deliberately positioned to form friendships, exchange confidences, and draw out conversations that would never surface during a formal interrogation. Together, these methods formed a sophisticated intelligence network in which information was gathered not through coercion, but through natural interaction. This model did not exist only at Fort Hunt. On the West Coast, the Byron Hot Springs camp in California was established to apply the same approach to Japanese prisoners, demonstrating that this soft strategy was a systematic choice rather than a random exception. One of the most illustrative cases at Fort Hunt was that of Werner Henke, the commander of the submarine U-515, a battle-hardened U-boat officer known for his stubbornness. After his capture, Henke maintained absolute silence and refused to cooperate. The interrogators did not beat him or subject him to physical questioning. Instead, they deployed a carefully calculated psychological maneuver. Henke was informed that he might be handed over to the British to be tried as a war criminal, a prospect that, in the mind of a U-boat officer, was almost synonymous with a death sentence. That psychological pressure was enough to shatter his internal balance. On his final night at Fort Hunt, Henke panicked to the point of attempting to climb the perimeter fence and was shot dead by a guard. The tragic outcome reflected the American philosophy with striking clarity. They were willing to use psychological stratagems and even accept risk, but they avoided direct violence, believing that vague fear and inner anxiety could be more effective than blows or torture. It was not only the Americans who recognized the power of this approach. The British, their close allies, reached the same conclusion early on. At Trent Park, a special detention facility for captured German generals, they created what amounted to a true luxury prison. Spacious villas, carefully maintained gardens, lavish meals, and fine wine. German generals were treated as fallen gentlemen rather than criminals, leading them to believe they were being favored. In that comfortable atmosphere, vigilance gradually faded. Few suspected that the entire estate, from the living rooms and fireplaces to the very trees in the garden, had been fitted with listening devices. As a result, in conversations that seemed entirely private, 59 German generals inadvertently revealed a wealth of crucial information about the machinery of war, internal morale, and even the fractures within Hitler's leadership circle. It was a victory of intelligence and patience, achieved without a single act of violence. Ironically, even within the heart of Nazi Germany, there were those who understood this truth. Captain Hans Scharf of the Luftwaffe, one of the most effective interrogators when dealing with captured Allied pilots, openly rejected torture. Instead of beatings, he took prisoners on walks in the forest, showed them American newspapers, offered tea and cigarettes, and spoke with them as ordinary human beings. That very friendliness led many pilots to reveal information without ever realizing they had done so. Scharf became so well known that after the war he was invited to the United States to teach interrogation techniques. His career stands as a bitter testament to reality. The brutality of the Gestapo was less effective than a decent meal and calculated empathy. All of this demonstrates that the American soft approach was not a solitary moral gesture, but an art form that was studied, tested, and systematically implemented. Rather than destroying the enemy's body, they focused on penetrating the opponent's mind, using respect to undermine conviction and a sense of safety to loosen secrets. The reward for this approach was not scattered confessions, but deep, wide-ranging, and strategically valuable intelligence hauls, contributing decisively to Allied superiority in a war where information could be as dangerous as bombs and bullets. History records a rather cold truth. The most valuable intelligence successes, achieved by the United States and the Allies during World War II, rarely came from screams inside interrogation chambers. but from an interrogation system built on patience, on creating a sense of safety, and on unlocking the enemy's mind by allowing them to speak while their defenses were at their lowest. When prisoners are made to believe they are being treated as human beings, they are not only thrown off by the contrast with the enemy image constructed by propaganda, but they also fall into a fatal psychological trap. They begin to regard talking as normal, even harmless, and it is precisely from that small crack that major pieces of intelligence gradually fall into place. As early as 1941, this lesson emerged in a context few would have expected. After the German battleship Bismarck was sunk, the Royal Navy rescued a group of German sailors drifting at sea. That act of rescue was not merely a matter of maritime ethics. It triggered a profound psychological reversal. These German sailors had been taught that the enemy would shoot them in the water. Yet instead, they were pulled aboard, bandaged, fed, and treated with decency. As the fear of annihilation disappeared, it was replaced by shock, and an indescribable sense of gratitude and cooperation followed. From such exchanges, the Allies obtained internal details about the ship, its compartment layout, fire control mechanisms, systemic flaws, and the fatal weakness in its rudder. These were not glamorous victory secrets, but genuine wartime data, allowing the Allies to gain a deeper understanding of a naval adversary that had once been seen as an unstoppable monster, and to draw lessons that would shape future naval engagements. In North Africa, the scale of the story became far larger. When the Afrika Korps collapsed and tens of thousands of German and Italian troops surrendered in 1943, the Allies did not merely capture an army. They acquired a living archive in POW camps, and especially in interrogation and listening facilities. Officers who had served on the front lines began to describe the Desert War in ways that operational reports never fully captured. The grinding erosion of morale, especially the constant thirst for fuel, supply lines stretched like a tightening noose, and the reality that Rommel was forced to fight fast because he lacked the resources to fight long. What sounded like the personal reflections of defeated soldiers became strategic data, allowing the Allies to identify the Axis powers' true points of failure. It was in this environment, in places such as Trent Park, that German generals placed in comfortable, disarming surroundings began to let their guard down. Some inadvertently mentioned what they believed to be secret sources of pride, new weapons programs they had heard about or personally witnessed being tested in Germany, including the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. The crucial point was not the information itself, but how it was obtained. The Allies did not extract it through coercion, but by creating a space in which their opponents felt free to boast, to unburden themselves, to speak as if among insiders who understood war. Once those remarks were captured, the intelligence analysis machinery moved immediately, like an industrial system coming to life, alerting, tracing, verifying, and narrowing down targets. From there, the narrative flowed directly toward Peenemünde and the race to dismantle Hitler's wonder weapons at PO. Box 1142 at Fort Hunt. American interrogators did not question prisoners with demands to confess, but in a way that made them feel they were stepping into a technical discussion among professionals. When German engineers, technicians, and specialists were confronted with highly specific questions about Peenemünde, questions that struck directly at the heart of the secret, their reaction was often not fear, but confusion. Once a prisoner realized that the other side already possessed part of the truth, maintaining total denial became difficult. Saying the wrong thing risked appearing ignorant. Saying nothing risked suggesting that something even larger was being concealed. This was the moment when soft interrogation became an art form. Enough information to convince the prisoner that the secret was already exposed, and enough patience to let them fill in the rest themselves. The result was a stream of intelligence reports that pushed the Allies to accelerate countermeasures against the V weapons program, including the large-scale bombing of Peenemünde significantly disrupting Germany's V-weapon development and easing the later threat of devastation against Britain. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the logic of meals and respect proved effective in a different way. Not to extract a single decisive secret, but to gather countless small technical details that together created a major advantage. Many U-boat sailors and commanders, once captured, were sent to Fort Hunt, where questions were framed like casual conversation. What type of torpedoes did you use on board? What was their effective range? When you were being hunted, what did you do to escape? The answers, fragmented on their own, when placed side by side, allowed the Allies to better understand threats, such as acoustic torpedoes, and the improvements that enabled submarines to survive longer. Because of this, escort tactics were adjusted, countermeasures were developed, and detection tools were refined. Here, intelligence was no longer a single decisive blow, but a process of attrition. Each small piece of information reduced a portion of the U-boat's advantage, and when enough pieces had been stripped away, the balance across the entire theater began to shift. In the same way, humane interrogation produced not only technological insights or target locations, but something even more important: a clear picture of the German military's organizational structure. As prisoners from different ranks were questioned, Allied intelligence gradually reconstructed the Wehrmacht's order of battle through a process of cross-referencing, unit insignia, division numbers, commanders' names, deployment areas, troop rotation routes, morale, and levels of loss. These data did not require a single, perfect confession, because the analytical system filtered reliability by verifying sources, comparing testimonies, and cross-checking them against reconnaissance and code-breaking intelligence. As preparations for D-Day began, knowing where the enemy was and which units they belonged to was no longer secondary information, but the foundation for deception operations, for choosing breakthrough points, and for anticipating counterattacks. In other words, while bombs and shells were being prepared for the day of the landings, another war had been quietly underway for a long time. The war to understand the enemy's structure. That is why those prominent examples are only the tip of the iceberg. In reality, the true power of humane interrogation did not lie in extracting a single secret, but in creating a sustained flow of information, enough for the Allied intelligence system to assemble a complete picture of the war, from technical details about jet weapons to coastal defense plans, from cracks in fighting morale to signals about espionage networks and propaganda efforts. Everything was gradually decoded, not through batons and whips, but by people seated behind desks, with hot coffee, patience, and a question asked at exactly the right moment. In total war, the decisive weapon is sometimes not what inflicts more pain on the enemy, but what causes them to speak more freely. War is always the harshest test of violence, a realm where moral limits are easily cast aside in the pursuit of victory. Yet within that brutality, the story of the United States turning meals and respect into intelligence tools reveals a profound paradox. In a total war dominated by guns, bombs, and industrial killing power, the most effective weapon is sometimes not fear, but the ability to understand human beings. The Americans did not gain the upper hand by being more ruthless than their enemies. On the contrary, they prevailed in part because they dared to move against the familiar logic of violence, choosing to engage the enemy's psychology rather than crush them through torture. When an enemy expects annihilation but is met instead with respect, that moment of disorientation opens the door to information, to cooperation, and to the erosion of beliefs carefully constructed by wartime propaganda. German and Italian prisoners who experienced that treatment returned home with a mindset completely different from the one they had carried into battle. They no longer viewed the United States through the lens of fascist propaganda, in which the enemy was portrayed as inhuman monsters. The experience of being properly fed, medically treated, and regarded as human beings inside prison camps shattered that image from within. After the war, many continued to exchange letters with former camp officers, seeing them not as victors, but as people who had shown them a different face of war. Some returned to visit the United States, as if revisiting a singular memory, a place where they first realized that an enemy could also embody decency. A significant number even chose to remain, settling and building new lives on the very land that had once confined them, becoming citizens who contributed to American society. In this way, restraint in victory planted the earliest seeds of post-war reconciliation, transforming the relationship between victor and vanquished into a foundation for lasting peace, rather than resentment carried across generations. By contrast, history has shown little mercy to regimes that built power on torture and violence. Systems that treated fear as the ultimate instrument of rule left behind anger, trauma, and a morally corroded legacy. World War II, therefore, stands not only as a lesson in tactics and military industry, but as a stark reminder that raw firepower alone has never been enough to guarantee enduring victory. One side fought through destruction, while the other struggled to preserve human dignity, even under the harshest conditions. And over time, the moral balance, and with it the judgment of history, tended to favor those who respected human worth. Victory achieved through violence may end a war, but only victory grounded in humanistic ideals can shape the peace that follows. The words of the legendary interrogator Hans Scharf thus represent more than a psychological trick. They express a deeper philosophy. You can catch more honey with a drop of sugar than with a barrel of vinegar. In the contest of wills among people swept into the machinery of war, humanity proved a stronger psychological lever than any form of coercion. The United States during World War II demonstrated this convincingly. Understanding human beings can sometimes be the key to gaining the upper hand in a conflict that seems driven solely by violence. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy a great power can leave to history. Victory through strength, remembered for humanity.